Did you know that in 1967, an entire film was nearly destroyed because of a single scene where a woman explored her own body in a mirror? The censors didn't just want to cut the frame, they wanted to erase the very idea of female self-discovery from history. They called it filth, but audiences saw a revolution. While the 50s taught us restraint, the 60s tore the masks off. Today, we unearth 15 masterpieces from that era that were deemed too dangerous for your eyes. Films where every frame is an act of defiance, and every scene is a victory over the ban. Number 15. Psycho, 1960, directed by Alfred Hitchcock. This film didn't just break the rules of Hollywood, it slaughtered them in a cold, tiled shower stall, changing the DNA of cinema forever. In 1960, the film industry was a fortress of rigid moral boundaries and predictable safety, but Alfred Hitchcock chose to drag the audience away from the glitz of the city and into the damp shadows of a roadside motel where the rules of polite society no longer applied. The scandal that erupted wasn't merely about the sudden, jarring violence. It was the visual of Janet Leigh in her intimate white underwear and the unprecedented, shocking shot of a flushing toilet, details that the production code found utterly repulsive and tried to scrub from the screen entirely. But the true provocation, the thing that truly terrified the censors, was the gaze. Hitchcock turned the camera into an active, breathing voyeur, making every single person in the theater complicit in the act of watching a woman in her most private, vulnerable moments of transition and domestic life. By blurring the line between the innocent observer and the hidden, nameless predator, Psycho forced a repressed society to confront a darkness it had spent decades trying to sanitize and ignore. It suggested with terrifying clarity that danger wasn't lurking in the distant streets or foreign lands, but in the private, domestic spaces we consider our sanctuary. The female body, when viewed through this lens of obsession, became a trigger for a national moral emergency. Hitchcock's refusal to provide a safe, moral distance meant that the audience was no longer just watching a movie, they were experiencing a violation of the soul that shattered the illusion of the perfect American decade and paved the way for a more brutal, honest era of storytelling. Number 14. L'Avventura, 1960, directed by Michelangelo Antonioni. Michelangelo Antonioni's masterpiece arrived like a cold, existential breeze that shattered the fragile glass house of post-war morality. In the early 1960s, cinema was traditionally expected to be a moral compass. It was supposed to punish immoral women or lead them toward a path of spiritual redemption, but L'Avventura refused to follow the script, offering no easy answers, no heroes, and absolutely no moral closure. It featured women who moved through the oppressive Mediterranean heat with a raw, unapologetic autonomy, expressing complex, messy desires that weren't tied to marriage, motherhood, or the safety of a domestic cage. Censors around the world were terrified not just by the flashes of skin, but by the void, the haunting, rhythmic lack of regret or consequence that permeated every frame. When a central character mysteriously disappears on a desolate island, the search doesn't lead to a resolution, but instead turns into a series of aimless, erotic encounters that suggest a profound and dangerous spiritual boredom. This wasn't just a film about a disappearance. It was a radical declaration that a woman's internal life and her physical urges could not be neatly contained, labeled, or explained away by a moralizing narrator. It challenged the very structure of how we consume stories, replacing the comfort of a plot with the discomfort of presence. Antonioni showed that a woman who is truly indifferent to the judgment of society, who exists for her own sensory experience rather than for a man's redemption, is the most dangerous threat to a controlled and stagnant culture. It remains a landmark of risque cinema because it dared to suggest that the greatest mystery isn't where we go, but what we truly want when no one is watching. Number 13. The Virgin Spring, 1960, directed by Ingmar Bergman. Ingmar Bergman used the female body as a silent, tragic witness to the collision between ancient, uncompromising religious faith and the primal, earthbound brutality of the human animal. In The Virgin Spring, the depiction of human trauma was stripped of every ounce of Hollywood glamour and artifice, presented instead with a stark, medieval realism that left international censorship boards in a state of total paralysis and disbelief. They demanded extensive, brutal cuts to the central assault sequence, fearing that such a naked truth would permanently dismantle the myth of the protected home and the supposed sanctity of the family unit. The film was dangerous because it suggested that evil isn't found in distant monsters or mythical demons, but in the very nature of man and the deafening silence of a God who refuses to intervene. By forcing the audience to look directly at the physical reality of violence, the textures of the forest, the coldness of the ground, and the absolute vulnerability of the victim, without the comfort of a safe edit or a quick cutaway, Bergman proved that cinema could be a weapon of truth that no censor's scissors could ever truly blunt. The provocation here was spiritual as much as it was physical. It explored the shame of survival and the sin of vengeance in a way that felt almost too intimate for a public screen. It remains a harrowing reminder that beneath the thin veneer of civilization lies a volatile, ancient energy that the 1960s were only just beginning to name, and that the ultimate proof of our shared humanity is found in the moments where we are most exposed and most broken. Number 12. Splendor in the Grass, 1961, directed by Elia Kazan. Elia Kazan returned to the screen with a burning vengeance to expose the one thing the 1950s had desperately tried to bury under layers of white picket fences and forced smiles: the devastating psychological and physical cost of sexual repression. Starring Natalie Wood in her most fearless and fragile performance, the film follows a young woman whose natural, healthy desires are twisted into a terrifying mental breakdown by the crushing weight of puritanical expectations and the toxic gossip of a small town. The censors of the time found the intimate bathtub scenes and Wood's raw, hysterical outbursts to be excessive, unfit for public viewing, and a threat to the mental health of the youth. But the real threat wasn't the nudity. It was the film's unwavering honesty about the reality of female frustration and the biological drive that society tried to ignore. It dared to show that when a culture denies the body's natural instincts, it doesn't create purity or safety, it creates a powder keg of madness, resentment, and shattered lives. Splendor in the Grass served as a heartbreaking mirror held up to an entire generation of young women, showing that the real scandal wasn't the desire itself, but the systemic, institutionalized shame used by the establishment to keep that desire in the dark. Kazan's direction made the audience feel the heat of the characters' skin and the desperation of their touch, making it a scream for help that signaled the definitive end of the era of forced innocence and the beginning of a much darker, more honest conversation about the high price of morality in America. Number 11. The Children's Hour, 1961, directed by William Wyler. This film stands as a haunting, atmospheric study of how silence, whispers, and shadows can be infinitely more destructive than any spoken word or explicit act. In 1961, the mere mention of a forbidden attraction was enough to trigger a national moral emergency and completely blackball entire careers. Audrey Hepburn and Shirley MacLaine deliver career-defining performances as two teachers whose lives, reputations, and souls are systematically unraveled by a single, malicious lie whispered by a vengeful child. The production code struggled to find a way to censor the film because the supposed crime was never actually shown, never consummated, and never even fully named. It lived entirely in the heavy subtext, the lingering glances, and the suffocating spaces between the lines of dialogue. It portrayed a world where the mere suspicion of nonconforming desire was a death sentence, proving that a society's imagination is often more obscene than reality itself. By exploring these forbidden themes of identity and social persecution, The Children's Hour showed that the most risque thing in cinema isn't a lack of clothing or a graphic scene, but the exposure of a society's deep-seated hypocrisy and the quiet, polite violence of its morality. Wyler's camera captures the isolation of these women with a cold, surgical precision, challenging the audience to consider that the real monsters weren't the ones breaking the social taboos, but the righteous ones enforcing them through fear, isolation, and the power of a whispered word. Number 10. Jules and Jim, 1962, directed by François Truffaut. A woman who loves two men equally, who refuses to be a victim, and who rejects the idea of choosing between them. This was the radical, pulsing heart of Jules and Jim that sent shockwaves through the conservative censorship boards of the early 60s. Jean Moreau's character, Catherine, was the absolute antithesis of the loyal, suffering wife trope that Hollywood had spent decades perfecting for the masses. She was a chaotic force of nature, impulsive, brilliant, and sexually autonomous, representing a terrifying future where female desire could exist without apology, without guilt, and without the need for a traditional domestic cage. The film arrived as a vibrant, cinematic explosion of the French New Wave, challenging the foundational myth of monogamous perfection and suggesting that gender roles were merely a fragile construct that could be ignored or rewritten at will. Censors were deeply alarmed by the casualness of the living arrangements and the total lack of moral condemnation for Catherine's lifestyle. It was a film that celebrated the messy, unrefined beauty of life and passion over the rigid laws of decency, proving that the most provocative act a woman could commit was to live entirely on her own terms, governed only by her own heart. By the time the final frames rolled, the old image of the submissive, predictable woman was dead, and a new, unpredictable icon of freedom had taken her place, forever changing the global landscape of what was considered permissible in the name of art and human truth. Number 9. Dementia, also known as Daughter of Horror, 1955/1960 re-release, directed by John Parker. Though its origins lie in the mid-50s, this film became a defining cult sensation of the underground 60s because it represented a total, terrifying breakdown of cinematic sanity. Dementia is a fever dream captured on celluloid, a silent, dialogue-free descent into the fractured mind of a woman haunted by trauma and dark, unspoken desires. The censors of the era were practically paralyzed by this film because they didn't know how to classify its transgressions. It features a protagonist who wanders through a neon-lit urban hellscape, encountering grotesque symbols of gluttony, vice, and patriarchal violence. The visual language is aggressively provocative. The camera lingers on the Gammon's expressive, terrified face and her stark, suggestive movements in a way that felt predatory and voyeuristic to the moral guardians of the time. The New York State Board of Regents banned the film entirely, labeling it inhuman and indecent, not because of explicit nudity, which was cleverly avoided through shadows, but because of its overwhelming sense of sexual dread and the shameful depiction of a woman's psychological instability. By the time it was re-released in the early 60s with haunting narration by Ed Wood, it had become a symbol of everything the establishment feared, a raw, distorted reflection of the female psyche that refused to be silent, polite, or cured. It remains one of the most visually daring and risque experiments in history, proving that the most terrifying thing a woman can do is show the world the unfiltered contents of her darkest, most forbidden dreams. Number 8. Scarlet Street, 1945/1960 TV resurgence, directed by Fritz Lang. While originally a product of the late 40s, Scarlet Street haunted the 1960s as a definitive, dark blueprint for the femme fatale, who destroys the status quo without a shred of remorse or hesitation. Joan Bennett's portrayal of Kitty March was a direct, calculated assault on the concept of the virtuous woman. She was depicted as a manipulative, sensuous predator who used her physicality to lead a weak, older man to his absolute moral and financial ruin. The censorship boards in major cities like New York and Milwaukee were so incensed by the film's moral corruption that they banned it outright upon its initial release, and these bans were still being fiercely debated years later as the film gained a second life on television. The provocation lay in the film's ending, or rather, its shocking lack of traditional justice. In the rigid world of the production code, crime and sinful passion were supposed to be punished by the law, but Fritz Lang allowed his characters to suffer in a much more risque and psychological way, through permanent guilt, creeping madness, and the lingering ghost of a woman's mocking laughter. The camera captures Bennett in a state of casual, domestic eroticism, lounging in bed, painting her toenails with slow intent, or wearing heavy silk robes, which suggested a level of intimacy and shamelessness that was considered a direct threat to public order and the sanctity of the home. It taught a new generation of viewers that desire is a beautifully designed trap, and that the most dangerous weapon in Hollywood wasn't a gun, but a woman who knew exactly how much her beauty was worth on the cold black market of human souls. Number 7. Suddenly, 1954/1960's notoriety, directed by Lewis Allen. This film's strange journey through the 1960s is a story of intense political and moral suppression. Suddenly is a cold, calculated thriller that centers on an assassination plot against the president, but its true, risque nature comes from its brutal, nihilistic tone and the way it strips away the thin veneer of American post-war safety. The film features a raw, violent energy that felt dangerously close to the real-world political tensions of the decade. Following the tragic events in Dallas in 1963, the film was practically erased from public view, withdrawn from circulation because its depiction of a cold-blooded, professional killer was deemed too triggering and provocative for a grieving and paranoid nation. But beyond the politics, the film's true intensity lies in its claustrophobic setting, where a suburban family is held hostage in their own living room. The tension is thick with an unspoken, dark subtext. The way the invaders interact with the domestic space is a violation of the sacred American home. Censors struggled with the film's coldness. It offered no warmth, no heroic comfort, only the stark reality that violence and chaos can penetrate even the most moral and protected household. It was a film that whispered a terrifying truth, that the perfect life was a fragile illusion, and that beneath the manicured lawns lay a capacity for destruction that society wasn't yet ready to face. Its suppression for years only added to its legend as a piece of forbidden cinema that dared to show the cracks in the national armor during a time of total upheaval. Number 7. Suddenly, 1954/1960's notoriety, directed by Lewis Allen. This film's strange journey through the 1960s is a story of intense political and moral suppression. Suddenly is a cold, calculated thriller that centers on an assassination plot against the president, but its true, risque nature comes from its brutal, nihilistic tone and the way it strips away the thin veneer of American post-war safety. The film features a raw, violent energy that felt dangerously close to the real-world political tensions of the decade. Following the tragic events in Dallas in 1963, the film was practically erased from public view, withdrawn from circulation because its depiction of a cold-blooded, professional killer was deemed too triggering and provocative for a grieving and paranoid nation. But beyond the politics, the film's true intensity lies in its claustrophobic setting, where a suburban family is held hostage in their own living room. The tension is thick with an unspoken, dark subtext. The way the invaders interact with the domestic space is a violation of the sacred American home. Censors struggled with the film's coldness. It offered no warmth, no heroic comfort, only the stark reality that violence and chaos can penetrate even the most moral and protected household. It was a film that whispered a terrifying truth, that the perfect life was a fragile illusion, and that beneath the manicured lawns lay a capacity for destruction that society wasn't yet ready to face. Its suppression for years only added to its legend as a piece of forbidden cinema that dared to show the cracks in the national armor during a time of total upheaval. Number 6. Killer's Kiss, 1955/1960's cult status, directed by Stanley Kubrick. Before he became a world-renowned master of grand spectacles, Stanley Kubrick explored the grimy, erotic underbelly of New York City in a film that defines the risque aesthetic of the urban noir. Killer's Kiss is a story of obsession, shadows, and the desperate physical connection between two lost, lonely souls. The film is famous for its dreamlike, almost surreal sequences, including a legendary, nightmarish fight in a warehouse filled with hundreds of naked mannequins. This scene alone was a nightmare for the censors of the time. The sight of dismembered female forms being used as blunt weapons was seen as a disturbing, perverted metaphor for the objectification of women in modern society. The camera lingers on the protagonist's cramped apartment, capturing moments of stark, lonely intimacy that felt far too real and far too dirty for the sanitized standards of the era. Kubrick's use of high-contrast light and shadow doesn't just set the mood, it acts as a silent voyeur, peeking into windows and capturing the naked desperation of the city's inhabitants. The film was considered incredibly bold because it didn't try to hide the dirt or the sweat of human existence, it celebrated it. It showed a world where people were driven by their base, animal instincts, lust, fear, and the sheer need for survival, rather than by good, societal values. For a 60s audience rediscovering this early Kubrick work, it was a revelation of how the camera could be used to strip away all social pretenses and reveal the raw, pulsing heart of human desire in its most shameless and authentic form. Number 4. Blow Up, 1966, directed by Michelangelo Antonioni. In 1966, Blow Up became the film that effectively killed the production code and changed the rules of what was allowed on screen forever. Antonioni didn't just push the boundaries, he walked right over them with a cold, detached elegance that left moral guardians speechless. The film follows a fashion photographer in swinging London who may or may not have captured a murder on film, but the real scandal was the casualness of its intimacy. For the first time in a major mainstream release, the camera captured natural, unsimulated-looking nudity and a revolutionary attitude towards sex that was completely devoid of shame or the traditional moral punishment. The famous scene involving a romp in a photography studio was a direct middle finger to the censors, who demanded it be cut. MGM, the studio, made the unprecedented move of releasing the film through a shell company to bypass the mandatory seal of approval, proving that the public was more interested in raw truth than in artificial morality. Blow Up was risque, because it mirrored the actual reality of the 60s, a world of shifting identities, drug culture, and a new, liberated generation that saw the old censorship laws as a decaying relic of the past. It remains a masterpiece of style and subversion, showing that the most provocative image isn't just the skin you see, but the absolute lack of apology from the person showing it. Number 3. Belle de Jour, 1967, directed by Louis Buñuel. With Belle de Jour, the legendary provocateur Louis Buñuel took the most sacred image of the decade, the elegant, upper-class housewife, and dragged her into a world of secret, dark fantasies. Catherine Deneuve stars as Séverine, a woman who spends her afternoons working in a brothel to satisfy the desires her polite, sterile marriage cannot touch. This was more than just a risque plot, it was a psychological hand grenade thrown at the heart of bourgeois society. Censors were horrified by the film's blurring of reality and dream, unable to distinguish where Severine's domestic life ended and her shameless adventures began. The film was nearly banned in several countries due to its frank depiction of fetishism and its refusal to judge its protagonist for her double life. Buñuel's camera captures the textures of silk, lace, and skin with a cold, surgical precision that makes the audience feel like intruders in Severine's most private thoughts. It was a film that suggested that every perfect woman has a hidden room in her mind that no man can truly control. By refusing to offer a moralistic ending or a cure for Severine's desires, Belle de Jour became a landmark of cinematic rebellion, proving that a woman's imagination is the most dangerous territory a filmmaker can ever explore. Number 2. The Graduate, 1967, directed by Mike Nichols. The Graduate did something that Hollywood had feared to do for decades. It turned the predatory older woman into a complex, tragic, and undeniably iconic human being. And Bancroft's Mrs. Robinson became a symbol of a deep-seated domestic frustration that the perfect 50s had tried to ignore. The scandal wasn't just the affair between an older woman and a young graduate. It was the cold, businesslike way she approached her own desire. Censors struggled with the film's dry, cynical humor, and the way it made the audience sympathize with a woman who was breaking every social and moral taboo of the time. The famous leg frame shot on the poster was just the beginning. The film's true provocation lay in its silence, the empty spaces in Mrs. Robinson's life that she tried to fill with a young man's presence. It portrayed the American dream as a hollow, plastic prison, and the risque relationship as the only thing that felt real in a world of fakes. The Graduate was a cultural earthquake because it spoke to a generation of youth who were tired of their parents' lies, and it gave a voice to the shameless woman who refused to apologize for her loneliness or her lust. It remains a definitive study of the gap between how we are told to live and how we actually feel when the lights go out. Number 1. Barbarella, 1968, directed by Roger Vadim. By the end of the decade, the wall of censorship had finally crumbled, and from the debris emerged Barbarella, a neon-colored, psychedelic explosion of pure, unadulterated sexual freedom. Starring Jane Fonda in a role that would define her career and her image for a generation, the film was the ultimate declaration of the sexual revolution. Barbarella wasn't a victim, a femme fatale, or a suffering wife. She was a space traveler who explored the galaxy and her own physicality with a sense of playful, innocent joy. The opening credits sequence, featuring a zero-gravity striptease, was a direct assault on every remaining taboo of the era. Censors were overwhelmed. The film was so unapologetically shameless and out there that it felt impossible to contain. It turned the female body into a site of adventure rather than shame, using campy sci-fi aesthetics to celebrate a future where morality was a thing of the past. Barbarella was dangerous because it made freedom look fun. It stripped away the heavy drama of the previous years and replaced it with a vibrant, visible, and vocal autonomy. It was the final victory of the 60s over the ghosts of the 50s, a film that looked the world straight in the eye and said that being risque was no longer a crime, but a new way of being alive. It stands as the definitive climax of a decade that started in the shadows of a shower stall and ended in the limitless, liberated glow of the stars. The 1960s tried to protect a dying version of society by controlling what we were allowed to see on the silver screen. They used scissors, bans, and moral outcries to bury the truth, but they couldn't stop the inevitable. Cinema remembers every frame they tried to burn, every silence they tried to fill, and every woman who looked back at the camera and refused to disappear. Which of these films do you believe was the most radical act of defiance? And which one still feels dangerous in our modern world? Let your thoughts live in the comments below.